The Interests of Working People, a new installment of Curriculum of Grace, a series of articles chronicling God's pursuit of a young man impervious to the teaching of elders. In the fall of my sophomore year in college, I was befriended by Nate, a Marxist engineering student. We lived in the same Harvard dorm, Adams House, and met in the dining hall, where urns of coffee sat steaming in the late afternoon, and young radicals gathered to debate racism, black revolution, and the Vietnam War. It was 1968, 6 months before the notorious takeover of University Hall, where the bravado of those young radicals would earn them a beating by Cambridge police. When I returned for a visit after the strike, Nate sported a large bandage where his narrow forehead had collided with an officer's nightstick. On an October afternoon, as I sat at a little distance from the radicals listening to their conversation and nursing my coffee, Nate slipped into the seat next to me and asked what I thought of the debate. I was hesitant to answer. Through the fog of jargon, I wasn't even sure what they were arguing for or against. Nate, though, was persistent. Which of the positions we'd just heard, he asked, best reflected the interests of working people? The interests of working people? How was I supposed to know that? Like everyone else I knew at Harvard, I'd grown up in an upper-middle-class family. The only working people I came in contact were servers on the cafeteria line, to whom I said next to nothing. Nate, however, was surprisingly well versed in the interests of working people and patiently set about explaining the advantages and disadvantages of the views we'd been listening to. Despite Nate's thoughtful and well-reasoned explanation, I didn't find Marxism appealing. Marxism meant revolution. Revolution meant violence. The year before, I'd read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Why on earth would any American want to repeat that exercise here? Nate apparently did. I noticed he consistently took the side of the most outspoken, self-assured, and forceful of the young radicals. Up to now, I'd had little interest in political issues, but with inner cities in turmoil and the war in Vietnam intensifying, I decided it was time to figure out where I stood on those issues, preferably without Nate by my side steering me. Over the course of the next year, I explored several groups that claimed to promote social change. Periodically, I would check in with Nate to vet my latest discovery. Nate would do his best to convince me that whatever group it was did not objectively serve the interests of working people, never mind what its mission proclaimed. Any organization that didn't explicitly call for revolution implicitly supported the status quo of capitalism, law, property rights, and the corrupt electoral system. The net effect of all the do-gooder organizations in the world was to lead working people into a capitalist dead end. Eventually, I succumbed to Nate's arguments. I became a follower of the Progressive Labor Party, PL, the communist organization he supported. By then I had dropped out of Harvard and was living in Providence. For a couple of years, Nate and I kept in contact, seeing each other occasionally at regional party meetings. We lost touch when I moved to Atlanta. There, over a period of several years, I became disillusioned with radical politics and eventually broke ties with the party and with my former colleagues. Leaving an organization like that can be traumatic. Those who remain feel betrayed. The person who leaves avoids contact for fear of reproach and being badgered to rejoin the group. Either way, close friends are no longer accessible. The security and affection of comradeship are gone forever. That was how I felt about Nate. I'd lost a friend. In fact, I'd lost nearly all my college friends. 50 years later, in my mid-60s, I looked back on the activist era with great sadness. By now I fully understood the folly of the New Left. The half-truths and outright deceptions of the radical movement had long since been expunged from my thinking. Gradually, over a period of years and through painful experience, I had come to see the interests of working people differently. I was less concerned about social change than about a strong economy, low inflation, safe neighborhoods, and a strong national defense. As I grew older, I found myself wondering if my former comrades had undergone such a transformation. If they hadn't, could we still find a way to enjoy one another's company? If sensitive subjects could be avoided, it would be wonderful to catch up on the lives of my former comrades and reminisce about our past exploits. As soon as this thought occurred to me, I had to try. Over the holidays, I sent Nate a card. He emailed me back, and when I next traveled to Boston to see family, I spent an evening with him and his wife, Beth. Nate's career as a computer scientist and systems analyst had left him well off. He and his wife lived in a former working-class neighborhood of Somerville, now gentrified, in a pleasant condominium with an upstairs large enough to accommodate grandchildren. Life experience hadn't changed Nate's view of capitalism, the plight of the working class, or U.S. foreign policy. Before retiring, he'd been shunted from one company to another in a series of buyouts that left him feeling insecure and undervalued. He explained that he had avoided management roles, leaving corporate strategy to others. In the old days, those others would have been the capitalists and their sycophants. Connecting the dots, it was easy to see why Nate's career hadn't flourished. I would have to be careful what I shared about my own life. As I'd hoped, Nate was more than happy to talk about our activist days. He didn't clearly recollect those long discussions that had had such an influence on me in our college years, but he did remember me as a comrade and didn't inquire whether my political outlook had changed. Of course, neither of us was still connected to PL. For Nate, it wasn't Marxist doctrine that drove him away, it was Beth. PL scrutinized the romantic interests of its members. Beth didn't appreciate that. If he wanted a future with her, he'd have to back away from the movement. And a good thing, too, Beth chimed in, making sure I heard the whole story. Nate agreed. PL took advantage of its supporters. To promote its vanguard working-class leadership, the group routinely rounded up middle-class loyalists, sent them into impossible situations where they were outnumbered by police, and then claimed to have led an uprising of workers. For PL, loyal cadres were just cannon fodder. That was good to hear. I remembered something similar back in the day. Living in Providence and Atlanta, movement backwaters, I'd been largely shielded from violence, but I'd sensed the danger and was grateful now that I hadn't spent my activist days in New York or Boston, where PL ranks were so much stronger. As far as I could tell, Nate hadn't changed all that much in a half-century. In retirement, he tutored students in math at Ringe High School in Cambridge, once a technical school for working-class kids. I wondered if he saw his work there as advancing the interests of working people. The demographics were bound to be different now. He still took part in the occasional protest, mostly in support of the Palestinian cause. Though Jewish by birth, he seemed particularly antagonistic to Israel. Obviously, his thinking hadn't evolved much from our activist days, when any American ally was by definition unjust and rapacious. Beth, to my relief, got us away from politics by talking about family and grandchildren. Nate didn't contribute much and seemed to be having trouble following the conversation. At first I thought this was just hearing impairment, but sometimes even when Beth repeated a comment more loudly, he looked confused. Beth and Nate met at Northeastern University, where he worked as a janitor after being suspended from Harvard. She'd grown up in a working-class Catholic family. Her parents were deeply shocked when she brought home a Jewish boy from Harvard. She and Nate walked on eggshells, carefully avoiding any mention of politics. Beth had made a career as a hospital social worker. Her skill and empathy were evident in her deft management of the conversation, and have Nate when he had trouble following. Whatever else Nate had or hadn't accomplished in the past 50 years, he'd for sure married well. After that evening, I continued to send a card to Nate and Beth every year. He would thank me by email. My wife and I visited them once, but after that life intervened and we traveled to Boston less frequently. Throughout these years, God was at work in me. In 2021, I was baptized. In one of the holiday cards to Nate and Beth, I mentioned my new faith. Crickets from Nate that year. I wasn't sure what to make of his silence. He might be wary of me, sensing how much I'd changed since our radical days. Cognitive decline might have been more severe than I realized. Or perhaps we just weren't close enough for him to be curious about this new phase of my life. As I continue to search for lost friends and colleagues, I often wonder whether God brought them into my life, and if so, for what purpose. I'm pretty sure Nate wasn't part of his plan, at least not during the college years. He wouldn't have wanted me to be swept up in godless communism. Reconnecting later in life, though, seems more in line with where he's been leading me. Meetings with Nate opened my eyes to something I hadn't appreciated before. Despite our folly, God protected us from the violence PL sought to instigate. Nate through the gracious presence of Beth, and I through being consigned to movement backwaters, Providence and Atlanta. The meetings also drove home to me how important it's been for me to be open to his influence, through which I was set free of the prison of dogma. Nate, who appears not to have been so receptive, remains stuck there. What about Beth? At our visits, she made clear she isn't a believer now. References to Catholicism were all in the past tense. As a young girl, though, she must have made a profession of faith. If I'm right about God saving Nate from PL violence, she was his instrument. It's hard to believe there isn't some corner of her consciousness that is still open to his love and forgiveness. Through her, God could reach Nathan. With that possibility in mind, I'll keep sending my yearly card, including a personal update and acknowledgement of God's goodness. One never knows where, when, and how a seed germinates. I'm acutely aware of how many Christians, during the long years of my unbelief, contributed to my own tortuous journey to faith. In the meantime, I'll pray for Beth and Nate in the hope that they will welcome God into their lives and that we will see each other again someday, restored in body and mind, and be able to laugh together about how we labored in the prison of dogma till Christ set us free.